My name is Ryan. I'm 24, living alone in the suburbs south of Portland, Oregon. There's nothing special about me. Just an electrician, driving an old truck, drinking cold coffee every morning, and spending most of my time climbing ladders, checking wires, changing bulbs. I don't have many close friends. As time goes by, they get married, move away, or simply change their lives. I'm still the same. Work hard, come home, eat fried eggs in front of the TV, sometimes read a few pages of an old book. Partly because I'm not ready to commit to anyone, partly because I'm focused on one goal, opening my own repair shop. Not big, not fancy, just a nice little shop with my name on the sign where I can do repairs properly, without cheating or being careless. That dream keeps me awake when it's cold and rainy, and I'm crawling under someone's kitchen floor looking for a shorted wire. That morning was like any other. I had just finished an early shift, replacing a control board in an old apartment near the center. On the way home, I received a call from the dispatch office. A new client needed to check the garage lighting system in the west of the city. Not urgent, but requested to do it the same day. The address was in a posh residential area, not the kind of place where I usually call a small electrician. I typed the address into the GPS, then started driving. The sky was clear, but there was a chill in the late autumn. Red and yellow leaves fell on the sidewalk like a thin carpet. I opened the car window slightly, letting the wind blow in to wake me up. When I turned into that residential area, the space seemed to change. The asphalt road was smooth, every house was big, had its own gate, the grass was cut evenly like a painting. I noticed a special house, creamy white walls, dark tiled roof, black iron gate open, as if waiting for someone. That was the address I needed to go to. I turned off the car and got out. The automatic gate was still open. I walked slowly up the paved path to the garage. It was strangely quiet, no dogs barking, no children. Just the wind and the rustling of leaves underfoot. The side door of the garage opened as I reached for the toolbox. A woman stepped out, tall, straight, her silver-brown hair tied back in a bun. She wore a gray cardigan, dark pants, and soft leather loafers. She wore no heavy makeup, but she had a distinct air about her, as if she were used to people falling silent when she entered a room. "You're from the electricians," she asked, her voice low. Not high, but clear. I nodded, smiling a small smile. "Ryan." "I'm from Cascade Electric. You're calling about the flickering garage lights," I said, pointing to the roll-up door area. "Yeah, every time I open the door, the light flashes, and then goes out. Sometimes it comes back on and goes back off again. It's annoying," she said, her voice, even without any hint of annoyance or thanks. Just an announcement. I didn't pay any attention. Some customers were too polite. Some were too demanding. As for her, she was neither type. I nodded, grabbed my tools, and got to work. Angela. I learned her name later, didn't stay to watch like some of the other customers. She just pointed to the switch, then went back into the house, leaving me alone in the quiet of the spotless white-tiled garage. It took me about 10 minutes to figure out the problem. The old light sensor was faulty, plus the auxiliary circuit was miswired from the previous repair. I figured it would take about an hour and a half to replace and rewire it properly. As I worked, the room was almost completely silent. There was only the sound of screws, the soft click of the electrical box, and my own breathing. But strangely, I didn't feel uncomfortable with the silence. It wasn't cold nor lonely. It was like someone was leaving you alone, not out of indifference, but because they believed you knew what to do. When I closed the last electrical box and tested the system, the lights in the garage came on. Steady, steady, no more flickering. Satisfied, I put away my tools and was about to go and knock on the door to call her out to check. The door opened before I could touch it. Angela stood there coatless, holding a cup of tea, keeping a comfortable distance. "Done?" she asked, glancing at the lights. "Yes, I replaced all the sensors." "You shouldn't have any more problems. The old wiring was a mess. They must have wired it up temporarily last time," I explained, keeping my voice light. She nodded, not commenting further. I was about to say goodbye and leave when she asked, almost offhandedly, "Are you in a hurry? Could you check a few more switches in the back?" She said, her voice neither forceful nor polite. I was surprised, but not annoyed. "No problem, I have an empty afternoon slot," I replied gently. She nodded, then turned and led the way without waiting for any further response. I followed. And in that brief moment, I realized I didn't really want to leave, not because of the pay, nor because of my curiosity about this beautiful house, but because there was something in the air here, a feeling of stillness, sadness, and anticipation that made me want to know more. I followed her through the side door into the house. The interior was moderately bright lit by soft yellow lights. The oak floors were smooth. There was no carpet, no footsteps. The house was modern, clean, minimalist, but not cold. On the walls hung a few abstract paintings framed in thin black frames. No figures, no family, no souvenirs. Angela walked ahead, walking slowly, as if she were in a private exhibition. "The switch is in the hallway behind the kitchen," she said, pointing, not turning around. "I'll take a look," I said, pulling the voltmeter out of my pocket. The passage was narrow, with closed doors on either side. When I opened the cover of the switchbox at the end of the wall, Angela leaned against the side door, not saying anything. She didn't move, nor did she stand too close, as if she were watching, but not wanting to make me uncomfortable. The broken switch was the type that controlled the recessed light. The circuit was loose. I bent down to check, adjusting each wire with a screw. It didn't take long, but my hand shook slightly when I found her eyes still on me. Not the kind of scrutiny, nor the curiosity, like the eyes of someone remembering something old. "I think this switch uses the wrong bulb to begin with," I said, breaking the silence. "Oh, I'm not familiar with that. Since my husband died, I have outsourced all the technical work," Angela replied, her voice softer than usual. This was the first time she mentioned someone other than herself. I nodded slightly, not asking any more questions. But inside, something had changed. It was no longer a simple job. I was standing in the home of a woman who lived alone, not by choice but by circumstance. When I finished adjusting the wires and tested the switch again, the lights were on. Angela nodded slightly. "Good. Thanks," she said, her eyes still fixed on the ceiling. "Nothing. I'll take notes for the office," I replied, starting to pack up my tools. Angela stood still for a moment, then turned slightly and walked to a nearby window. She looked out at the back garden, where a few maple trees were shedding leaves in the wind. I didn't know whether to leave right away or wait for her to say more. "Has anyone ever told you that? A house that's too quiet can sometimes make you feel like you're disappearing." Angela said, her voice not directed at me, but as if speaking to herself. I squeezed the handle of my bag lightly, hesitating for a moment. "I think silence is only scary if you don't have anyone to share it with," I replied, not daring to look directly at her. Angela turned around, a smile playing on her lips, whether it was ironic or accepting. "So you still have someone to share it with?" I didn't answer, just pursed my lips and smiled softly. There was a long silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was as if we were both listening to the wind through the glass, like a piece of music that no one had to write. I stood there for another minute, not out of politeness, but because of something I couldn't name. Maybe it was the strangeness in the way she looked at things, not eager, but not completely abandoned. A kind of calm that made me both curious and at peace. Yar. When I got out of the car, the afternoon light was softer. The sky was still blue, but a paler shade than in the morning. I closed the car door, put my bag on the passenger seat, and glanced at the house behind the black gate. Something made me not want to leave right away. Not because the house was luxurious, or because Angela was so elegant like a painting, but because for the first time in a long time, I had entered a place that was completely silent, without the sound of a TV, without the sound of an air conditioner, without anyone blaming or pretending to care. There was only the sound of windlight and the presence of someone holding the space with a silent presence. I didn't know if I would see her again, but I knew one thing: I left with a strange feeling, not of being tired, not of being done, but of being held in my mind by something I didn't quite understand. A few days later, I received a text message from an unknown number. There was no greeting, just a short line. "If you're free, could you stop by this afternoon? There's a switch in the back of the house that I think is broken." I didn't need to ask who sent it. Though I hadn't saved the number, I recognized the writing style. Simple, unadorned, and a little distant. Like the writer had never needed to ask anyone for anything, but also wasn't used to giving orders. It was almost 4 when I arrived. The afternoon light stretched thinly across the lawn. The iron gate was still open, but the door was ajar, just like last time. I knocked lightly on the door, then spoke. "It's me, Ryan," I said, keeping my voice low. Angela appeared with a soft step. She was wearing a white shirt with rolled sleeves, her hair still tied back. She was barefoot today, which somehow made her look more human. "You brought Tool?" she asked, without elaborating. "Always," I replied, lifting the bag in my hand. She nodded. "Not in the kitchen or the hallway. It's in the back, an old room. I think the light's shorted, but I don't dare open it." "Let me take a look." I nodded, my eyes slightly raised in curiosity. Angela led me past the kitchen and turned right. I hadn't been there before. The light was a soft yellow, filtered through the thick curtains, casting a light, smoky pattern on the walls. We stopped in front of a dark wooden door. The handle was a bit dull, and perhaps no one had touched it in a long time. Angela stood still for a few seconds. It was unclear whether she was thinking or just giving the room a chance to prepare. "This room has been locked for years," she said, her hand on the doorknob, hesitant. I didn't answer. I stood still like a guest who knew she shouldn't do anything unless invited. Angela opened the door. The room was dim, with only one tall, narrow window light filtering in slanting lines through the thin layer of dust in the air. A studio. I recognized it from the smell, old paintwood paper, and something very special, like the smell of memory. In the middle of the room was an old easel with an unfinished picture frame on top. Around it were paintings lined up against the wall, some covered with cloth, some not. There was an upright piano in the corner, dusty, but not rusty. On the bookshelf were a manuscript, a few tubes of drying paint, and a brownish-yellow envelope neatly placed unopened. "He painted here every day." Angela said, her voice not exactly sad but distant, as if she were talking about someone who had become a shadow. I entered, stepping carefully across the wooden floor so as not to stir up too much dust. There was a ceiling light hanging from a twisted wire, an antique one, but not lit. "I guess this is the light you're talking about." I pointed to the ceiling. Angela nodded slightly. "I tried turning it on once. It didn't light up, so I gave up. No one comes in here." I pulled the stool back and climbed up to check. It was just as she said. The wire was shorted, the joints were loose, and the plastic cover had rotted over time. I took out my tools and fixed it, listening to the air in the room. Angela didn't leave. She stood near the piano, her hand gently running over the faded wooden lid. She didn't open it, she didn't play it. She just touched it, as if to remember. "This room is the last place that still holds his image." "Alive," she said, her voice deeper than the wind. I looked down, catching her gaze as she looked into the empty space in the middle of the room. No tears, but no strength, just pride in her loneliness. After the funeral, I locked the door. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I couldn't walk in without touching him everywhere. She continued slowly. I was silent, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I felt I shouldn't. I took off the old wire, replaced the connector, wrapped it tightly, and tried again. When I turned the switch near the door, the yellow light suddenly came on, softly but steadily. Angela didn't blink. She looked at the ceiling, the light catching in the corners of her eyes as if something had been pulled out of the darkness. "You're the first person to come into this room in almost 6 years," she said, her eyes never leaving the light. I lowered my hand, put away my tools, and stood still, looking around the room. The drawings, the scraps of paper, the faint fingerprints on the wooden table, and that unopened letter. "You can keep this up." I let out a long breath. "You really love me," I said, my voice low and sincere. Angela turned to look at me for the first time since we'd walked in, not smiling, not upset. She just looked, as if I'd just said something she never thought anyone would see. I put the last screwdriver in my pocket, but didn't leave my chair. The room lit up, even with a weak yellow light, and everything seemed more real. What had been a blur in the shadows was now visible, blotchy brush marks, smudged handprints, even a strand of gray hair stuck to the tabletop. I didn't know why I noticed those details. It was just that I felt like I was in the world of someone who had lived very deeply. Angela stepped closer to the easel, gently pulling back the cloth that covered it. Beneath it was an unfinished painting, the outline of a woman faceless, standing among the trees. "He started this a week before he died," she said, her eyes never leaving the canvas. I stood up and walked slowly closer, keeping a comfortable distance. "Are you the one in the painting?" I asked, my voice low. Angela shook her head. I asked him. He just smiled and said, "Not you yet. But maybe you in another life, where you thought less and got lost more often," she said, her mouth twitching in a half-sad smile. "I don't understand, and I don't need to understand now." "But you kept it," I said lightly, touching the wooden edge of the easel. "Because keeping it is the only way I can believe he was really here," she said, a short, spoken sigh. I don't know what made my throat dry. Maybe it was because I used to think of loss as something that happened to other people, to the elderly, to those who lived long, to those who were used to pain. But Angela standing there, her back straight, her words unshaken, made me understand there is a loneliness that comes not from age, but from having had someone who truly understood you and then disappeared. Angela moved to the bookshelf beside the piano, where the dark brown envelope lay the unopened letter. She picked it up, turning it gently in her hand, as if just to feel the weight of the memory. "I found it in your pocket after the funeral. Unsigned, undated. It might be unfinished. It might be for me. It might not be," she said, placing the letter back where it belonged. "You never tried to open it?" I asked gently. "No," she shook her head. "I was afraid. If I read it, it would be the end. If I left it alone, it would remain unsaid, and I could imagine anything." I nodded. "Sometimes not knowing is a form of hope," I blurted out. Angela looked at me, her eyes softening for the first time. Not glowing, but the look of someone who has begun to believe that the person opposite has not come out of curiosity, but because he really wants to be present. We left the room a few minutes later, neither of us saying anything more. I gently closed the door, and she turned the key, not locking it as before, just leaving it ajar, as if this time someone had entered the room not to take it away, but to brighten it up. We stopped at the kitchen. Angela poured tea for the first time, a light-smelling dried flower tea, no sugar, no milk, but fragrant like memories. She handed me a cup, then sat down on the chair opposite, placing her hand lightly on her teacup. "I'm not used to strangers entering that space, but you don't seem like a stranger," she said, looking out the window. "I'm not sure I understand anything, I just know." "I feel at peace," I answered honestly, and took a small sip. Outside, the sunlight was slanting through the late-season foliage, casting shadows on the backyard like a colorful painting. In that moment, I no longer saw Angela as a rich old lady living alone in a villa. I saw her as a woman who was silently preserving a part of herself, proudly not asking for help, but still hoping for someone thoughtful enough to stay longer than an afternoon. And I knew from that moment on, I would come back. Not for the switch, not for the pay, but because I began to want to understand that woman the way I understood each electric wire in the wall, quiet, complicated, but if patient enough, it would light up. After fixing the switch in the gallery that day, I thought I wouldn't come back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I thought that someone like Angela, self-possessed, calm, not eager to keep anyone, probably wouldn't want to call me again. But 2 weeks later, I received the same short message as before. "Are you free tomorrow afternoon? I want to check the porch lights." No name, no greeting. But after reading it, I smiled. This time, I came on a lightly rainy afternoon. The sky was pale gray. The trees in her garden were dripping with water. Angela opened the front door. She rarely came out to greet me like that. "Come in. The porch lights are out back. You should be able to handle the drizzle," she said, leaning over to let me in. "I have a raincoat and rubber gloves." "No problem," I replied, picking up my bag out of habit. I walked down the hall to the back of the house, where there was a long wooden porch overlooking the garden. The string lights were broken, some were not lit, some were flickering erratically. I began checking each socket, while Angela sat in the living room nearby reading. It was quiet except for the soft patter of rain on the roof and the occasional rustle of paper. "I've been sitting on the porch every morning since he died. Just a cup of tea in silence," she said when she saw me tightening the connectors. "Like a habit that helps you keep time?" I asked, smiling. "No, like I'm living the part of him that he didn't get to use," she said, her voice soft and confiding. I didn't answer, partly because my throat was tight, partly because I felt I shouldn't interrupt something so beautiful. That day, I spent nearly 2 hours fixing it. The rain was clearing as I closed the last lid. Angela poured me a cup of tea like last time. No questions asked, no elaborate invitations. Just set it down on the wooden table on the porch, then sat down on the chair opposite. I sat still for a moment, watching the new light fixture glow evenly, its yellow light reflecting off the wet wooden planks. "I don't know why you chose to text me. There are bigger, more professional services," I said, looking at her. Angela chuckled, still looking toward the garden. "Because you didn't leave any trouble. You came finished, and didn't try to fill the silence." "I don't think every silence needs filling," I replied gently, turning my fingers on the teacup. She didn't answer, but I saw something in her eyes, a kind of agreement without a nod. From that day on, I visited her house more often, not always for repairs. Some days it was just to check the circuit board. Other days it was to change the kitchen light bulb. But one day, she texted just to ask if I was free for afternoon tea. Angela always sat in the same place, a cushioned chair by the porch window. She loved chamomile tea, read paper books, and didn't use social media. No smartphone, no iPad. She once said, "I've seen the world go faster than my heart can handle." Once I asked, "Don't you feel lonely?" Angela looked up, looked at me for a moment. "Loneliness is different from being lost. I choose the head," she replied, sipping her tea. "And me," I hesitated. "Sometimes I don't know if I'm choosing or being pushed into being lost." "You're young, but it seems like you've been through some rough patches," she said, not with pity, but with recognition. I don't know what kind of relationship we had at that time. Not friends, because we didn't chat or laugh. Not grandma and granddaughter, because the distance despite age still doesn't feel like blood. Not a customer, because she hasn't paid me back in the usual way for a long time. Once she left a paper bag by the door inside was a gray wool scarf and a folded piece of paper. For the cold days, when you have to climb the roof. I used to knit. My hands aren't as fast as they used to be, but the yarn is still strong. I stood for a long time in front of the door when I received that gift. Not because I was surprised, but because my heart sank, the kind of sinking that made me feel like I had never been cared for so quietly. One early winter morning, as Portland began to be blanketed in white frost, I went to Angela's house to check the heating in the living room. She opened the door more slowly than usual, her gait faltering. She coughed slightly, then leaned against the doorframe. "You're just in time," she said, smiling slightly, but unable to hide the tiredness on her forehead. "Are you feeling unwell?" I asked, stepping inside. "Just a winter cold. I'm old, my resistance can't keep up with the weather," she replied, pulling her scarf higher around her neck. I checked the heater, wiped the dust off the exhaust fan. As I did, I heard Angela turn on the piano. She didn't play, just opened the lid and closed it. "I took piano lessons when I was 8. She said, her fingers moving over the keys, as if searching for memories. "Do you remember now?" I asked, turning my head slightly from the floor. Angela smiled faintly. "I remember, but my hands are not as soft as they used to be." "Try it," I suggested, as softly as if encouraging a friend to walk again. Angela hesitated, then put her hands on the keys. The sound rang out, thin, timid, and off-key. But between the off-key notes, there was something very real, a person trying to touch the oldest part of herself. I stood up and sat down on the chair opposite the piano. I said nothing, just listened. After a short passage, Angela paused. "I'm afraid I'll forget everything," she breathed. "You don't need to remember everything. Just remember enough to not lose yourself," I said, without thinking too much. Angela looked at me, her eyes softening for a beat. Not sad, just calm. A week later, Angela sent me a text message. "I'm going to see the doctor tomorrow." Nothing. "But if I'm late, can you stop by and feed the cat?" I didn't know she had a cat. But I said, of course. Just leave the key under the potted plant like last time. I arrived at 5 p.m. the next day. The house was quiet. There was a note on the kitchen table. "The cat's name is Oliver. You don't have to call him. He only comes out when he finds someone quiet enough." I poured water for the cat, opened the can of cat food. No cat. But I sat there on the old chair on the porch, holding a cup of warm, dried flower tea that I didn't know who had made. I waited, not for Angela, but for something in my heart to become clear. And just as I was about to get up, Oliver, a white and yellow cat, came out of nowhere, tiptoed over, and sat down next to me. No meowing, no rubbing, just there. Just like Angela. That evening when Angela returned, I was still on the porch. It was colder. She was a little surprised, but didn't ask why I hadn't come home yet. "Did I make tea?" she asked, hanging up her coat. "Maybe you forgot," I said, smiling. "Maybe I remembered you were coming," she replied, pulling up a chair across from me. We sat in silence. After a long while, I said, "What do you think?" "We are." Angela didn't look at me. She poured more tea, then said slowly, "We are something that others won't understand. And we don't need to explain." I nodded. "I don't need to name it. Just be there. And I don't need to keep you. Just come," she said, smiling. From then on, I began to understand there are bonds that have no labels, no promises, no age or circumstances. They just exist, like a light warm enough for a person to dare to walk through winter with another, without knowing whether spring will come or not. Angela didn't need a young man to make her feel alive. She just needed someone who wasn't afraid to stay, in silence in the old room over a short afternoon tea, to remind her that she wasn't gone. I didn't think I needed to hide Angela, not because I was proud, nor because I wanted to reveal something that wasn't clear, but because I never saw it as a secret. So late one night, over a beer with Tyler, my best friend from high school, I told him about fixing the lights in a locked room, about my first cup of chamomile tea, about Oliver, about the afternoons when no one said a word, but still felt full. As I told him, I imagined him chuckling, patting me on the shoulder and saying, "It sounds like a movie, but I get it." But Tyler was quiet for a moment, then squinted at me as if he wasn't sure what he'd just heard. "You're talking about a woman in her 60s, right?" Tyler asked, raising an eyebrow. 65, I replied, keeping my voice even. "And you sit there drinking afternoon tea, fixing switches, staring at cats," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I don't see what's funny," I said slowly. Tyler did laugh. But it was the kind of laugh that made me uncomfortable, laughing to defend something that people didn't understand. "Listen, Ryan," he said, leaning his elbows on the table. "She's rich, widowed, and alone. You're an electrician with nothing. What do you think she wants from you?" I squeezed the beer can in my hand, looking straight ahead. "That's not what you're thinking." "So what do you think you're doing, winning her over with screwdrivers?" Tyler laughed, shaking his head. I stood up and grabbed my jacket, not out of anger, but because I knew that words wouldn't change what was going on in his head. Abnormal things often ridiculed before they were understood. 3 days later, I was working at a house near the center when I got a text from a coworker. "Hey bro, you're famous." There was a link. I clicked on it. It was a social media post from someone in Angela's neighborhood, a neighbor perhaps. A distant photo, blurry but recognizable enough. I was walking out of Angela's gate shopping bag, on my shoulder shirt sleeves rolled up. The caption read, "They say money can't buy love, but it seems good service is very valuable." The post had a few dozen comments. Some just laughed. Others were sarcastic. "So she's not just a collector of paintings. This guy sure knows how to plug in." I read it without feeling angry. I felt empty. The empty drum wasn't loud, but it hit me right in the middle of my chest, the place where I had thought things were getting better. I didn't know if Angela had read it, but 2 days later, she called. I didn't pick up, not because I was embarrassed, because I didn't know what kind of face to make. How to look someone in the eye who once gave you light without making them feel like they've been dragged back into darkness. That afternoon, I received news from an acquaintance in the art industry. Angela had just lost a major art exhibition contract. The organizers didn't say it outright, but hinted that she was involved in a relationship of unclear morals, something that didn't fit with the image of an artist who honored traditional values. I stood for a long time in the parking lot in the gray afternoon light and the incessant honking of cars. I knew I wasn't the only reason, but I was the most visible excuse. A young electrician stepping out of the gate of a wealthy widow's house, in the eyes of outsiders that was never harmless. I didn't reply to any of Angela's messages after the day I found out about the contract. I didn't call back. I wrote a few lines and deleted them. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll explain." But none of them were enough. No words could take back the look she'd given me, and no words could make her feel any less hurt if I continued to show up like an uninvited shadow. I went to work as usual, repeating the routine, checking the lights, fixing the fuse, replacing the shorted wire. But every time I picked up the screwdriver, I remembered what she'd said. "You don't fill the void, you're just there." I used to think it was an acknowledgement. Now I saw it as more of a warning that if I went in, I had to stay long enough or leave well enough. Almost a week later, I received her last message. No name, no opening, just a short paragraph, cold and beautiful like a razor blade. If a little light is enough to blind you, then don't turn back. I don't keep people who are afraid of their own shadow. I read that line over and over again. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel blame. I just felt right. Angela always spoke in short sentences, but each word she chose was like putting a knife in the right place. I understood that she didn't need anyone's pity. She didn't need anyone to stay because of an inferiority complex. She needed someone brave enough not to back away when the light reached even the darkest part of their heart. As for me, maybe I wasn't ready yet. That night, I wandered around the city, with no destination. Through the brightly lit streets, the warm cafes, the couples talking and laughing. I sat on a wooden park bench holding my phone without pressing anything. I remembered every afternoon tea, every broken story, every moment when Angela was silent, but seemed to be holding the whole world in her eyes. I remember the smell of dried flowers, the sound of the piano keys out of tune, and Oliver the cat. The way he looked at me without judgment, just by being there. I used to think I was helping her forget her loneliness. But it turned out that she gave me something I never dared to name, the feeling of being seen. Not because of my age, not because of my job, not because of my appearance, but simply because I was me. I stopped going to her house. I continued working, saving every penny as before. But every time I opened the switchbox, I remembered her blinking when the light came on for the first time in 6 years. Every time I saw someone sitting alone on the porch, I remembered Angela's eyes, calm, but as deep as the wind blowing against the wind that never ends. And I knew the darkness is not scary. What is scary is not having the courage to look at yourself in the light that others have opened. I threw myself into work like a fugitive. I took on all sorts of contracts, from testing voltage in an old basement, to fixing stage lights in an abandoned theater, to rewiring the entire lighting system in a new residential area. Every day, I saw nothing but wires, bulbs, circuit breakers, and white light. But the more I did it, the more uncomfortably familiar it all seemed. Once, when I changed the kitchen lights in a small restaurant, the owner gave me a cup of hot tea, a gentle lavender scent. I didn't drink it. I just held it in my hand for a long time. Another time, I climbed up to the ceiling of a wooden house on the east side of town. When I finished screwing in the last bulb and flicking the switch, the yellow light fell just the way Angela liked it. Not too bright, not harsh, just right, like a late-season sunset. I stood there staring at the light for a long time, and then I realized I was missing her. Almost 3 weeks had passed since her last text. I didn't text back. I didn't come home. But every morning I glanced at her phone number, knowing there would be no news. Days like that became a habit. The habit of someone who tries to move on, but still puts a part of herself in the past. One Saturday afternoon, after fixing the wiring at a house, I drove past Angela's neighborhood. Not planning to stop, just looking. But as I slowly passed the gate, I saw something that made my heart stop. The porch light was still on. Not a sensor light. A yellow light. The kind she liked, which she turned on when it was getting dark. I pulled over, turned off the engine. Stand still for a few minutes, then get out. The gate was unlocked. I pushed gently. Silence. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Still no answer. I began to worry. Just as I was about to go around to the garden, I saw a man pruning a tree nearby. The new gardener, I guess. I walked over. "Excuse me, how long have you been here?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. "Not long. Almost 2 weeks," he replied, putting down the scissors. "I know the landlady. I saw the light on, but she didn't come out." "What's wrong?" I asked, lowering my voice slightly. The man exhaled. "I don't know much. I just heard she came back from a doctor's visit last week. She didn't look well. She sat on the porch for an hour, not saying anything. Someone mentioned the hospital and she shook her head. She seemed afraid of something." He paused, then added, "I think she's cut off contact with someone. She doesn't use her phone. She doesn't answer her letters." My heart pounded in my chest. I felt like I'd just taken a step too far. All the distance I thought was due to self-respect to shame. Turned out to be because she was afraid. Not of the eyes of the world, but of something lurking inside her own body. I turned around and walked straight to the front door. Didn't knock, just put my hand on the handle. It opened. The house was quiet, as clean as ever, but there was no scent of chamomile tea. No cat. No waiting eyes. I walked slowly and softly, as if afraid to break something fragile hidden in the walls. The last light of the day drifted down the hallway, casting long streaks on the wooden floor. I went straight to the locked room, her husband's studio. The door was ajar. There was a yellow light inside. Angela sat on the old chair, facing the unfinished painting. She did not raise her head when I entered. Her hands were on her lap, silent, but I saw her shoulders shake slightly. On the easel was an unfinished portrait. Of me, bent over the lamp, the yellow light covering my face. The sketches were unfinished, but I recognized myself. At that moment, in this very room. "You're afraid I'll see you weak," I said, standing behind her. "And I am afraid I'm not big enough to stand beside you." Angela didn't turn around, but she took a deep breath, a very deep breath, as if she were breathing hard for the first time in days. Angela didn't turn to look at me right away. She remained motionless in her chair, as if her entire body had been drained of energy. But then she raised her hand and gently traced a not yet dried brushstroke across the canvas, right where the golden light fell on my forehead. "I don't want you to see me like this," she said, her voice hoarse from sleepless nights. "Weak?" I asked, stepping closer. "Not immortal," she replied, smiling slightly, but tears were already falling down her cheeks. "I'm not immortal either. I'm just an electrician," I replied, sitting down next to her, keeping her distance enough not to break her, but close enough that if she needed me, she could lean on me. She was silent for a long time. Then she said softly, as if confessing, "I'm afraid if I become weak, I'll become a burden. And I've been the one who lost. I don't want to be the one left behind." I bowed my head. For the first time I felt angry, but not with her, with myself, for withdrawing when she needed someone to stay, for letting my outside prejudices overcome the truth inside. "I didn't leave because I saw you were weak. I left because I didn't think I was strong enough to stay," I said, looking at the unfinished painting. Angela looked at me. This time her eyes were no longer proud. They were tired and honest. "I don't need a young person to make me feel young again," she said gently, touching my hand that was resting on her lap. "I need someone who is honest, so I don't have to pretend to be strong every day." It started to rain outside, lightly. Drops slid down the window, streaking the yellow light in soft, wordless music. We sat there saying nothing more. No promises, no commitments. But in that atmosphere, something had been sewn together. A piece of fabric torn by misunderstanding, by fear, by the habit of retreating when hurt. And now that piece of fabric, even with its seams, was still a garment that could be worn again. Angela leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed. I sat beside her, not touching her. But in my heart, I knew I would not leave. At least, not while she sat like that in the middle of a room filled with memories, but finally, beginning to have a place in the present. A few weeks after we met again, Angela invited me over late one afternoon. No particular reason. Just, "Would you like to come over?" I went as was my custom. She sat on the back porch, holding a thin envelope. She set it down on the table as I pulled up a chair. "Nothing special. I just thought it was time to give you back some of the light you brought," she said, pushing the envelope toward me. I didn't open it. "If this is goodbye, I won't accept it," I said softly, but firmly. Angela chuckled. "It's not. It's a start. I hear you've always dreamed of opening your own shop." "Yes, but I never thought I was—" "Enough," I said, still looking at the envelope. "I invested," she said, pouring tea as usual. "I invested in light." I opened the envelope. Not a huge sum, but it was enough to get me off the starting line. And more importantly, it was Angela's way of saying she trusted me, no title, no ownership. "I'm not in the picture. You do things your way," she said, looking out at the yard. "Then I'll name the shop my way," I said, smiling. Angela raised her eyebrows. What I said slowly. "Ryan's Lights, for people to understand." She was quiet for a moment, then she nodded, as if hearing a pleasing melody. My electrical repair shop opened the following spring. A small shop on a Portland corner, a simple white sign, black lettering, no flash, but clean, neat, and every light was lit. I didn't hang Angela's picture. I didn't tell my customers her story. But every time I finished a job, every time a house light turned on properly, I knew. Somewhere in the city, someone was seeing that light too. We still lived apart. Angela didn't go to the shop. I didn't stay late at her house. But every week, we had afternoon tea. Always on the right day, at the right time, with the right tea. Neither of us called it love, nor friendship, just someone who was there when the other needed it without having to say anything. And gradually, I no longer felt strange when someone asked, "What are you and her?" To each other, I just smiled. Light. One evening in late autumn, I went to Angela's house as usual. It was chilly. The smell of damp wood in the garden reminded people to put on more clothes. We sat on the second-floor balcony, a place she had said few people came to. The tea was still chrysanthemum. I brought a small cake from the shop near my electrical repair shop. From here, I could see the whole street in the distance, where I had installed the lights for the old bookstore, the small cafe, and a red brick house with narrow windows. All the lights were still on. Evenly, softly. Angela looked down the street, her eyes narrowing slightly in the breeze. "Every time I see the lights," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "I know you're still here." I didn't answer. I just turned to look at her, then back at the street. Those lights? I had installed them by hand, but now they were glowing with my heart. Not all distances need to be shortened. Not all relationships need to be named. Some people come just to prove that someone sees the light in you, even when you forget it exists. Angela was that person to me, and I somehow became that to her. The story above is not so much about love, but it touches on something deeper, the meaning of presence. Angela doesn't need a young person to make her young again. Ryan doesn't need a romantic love to feel alive. They just need each other, at the right time, in the right way, and long enough to know that there are relationships that don't need a name, but are bright enough to guide each other through the darkest days. Thank you for listening to the end. If this story makes you smile, think, or simply feel accompanied, subscribe to the Daily Unexpected Stories channel to continue these gentle yet profound journeys together. Because at any age, love, connection, and quiet light are always present, if we know how to look and know how to hold on.